The brain functions as a biological machine where sensory inputs undergo a mechanical process of computation to produce observable behavioral outputs. This mechanistic view presents a paradox. If the underlying hardware is universal, then two individuals receiving the exact same sensory input should produce identical behaviors, yet they frequently do the opposite. When faced with a minor social slight, one person might execute a measured, law-abiding response, while another processes that same data point and erupts into a violent criminal reaction. Human behavior is the mechanistic result of a dual-layered processing architecture, ultimately filtered through a highly specific, quantifiable personality matrix. Every human operates using two foundational processing layers, the primitive subcortex and the advanced cortex. These universal layers are then routed through an individual filtering mechanism, an intersecting personality matrix that defines our unique character traits. To decode why we act the way we do, we must build this processing model layer by layer to see exactly how these behavioral loops are generated. The subcortex is the baseline, primitive computational engine of the human brain. The subcortex operates under a prime directive of immediate, short-term survival. It processes data in the present moment, with no capacity to calculate long-term consequences. This diagram illustrates two binary computational pathways of the subcortex. Every sensory input is categorized as a threat or a pleasure. If categorized as a threat, the subcortex outputs one of three automatic responses to preserve the organism: fight, flight, or freeze. This is why when a person in a bear costume suddenly moves in a store, most people flee or freeze in place. The subcortex triggers a panic response to unverified data before determining if it's a suit or predator. If categorized as pleasure, the subcortex interprets this as a signal that the situation promotes survival, driving behavioral repetition. We see this in dog training. When a dog sits and its owner strokes its head, the subcortex links the pleasure of the stroke with the sitting posture. The dog repeats the behavior to ensure the pleasurable stimulus continues. Because the subcortex calculates only for the immediate moment, it relentlessly pursues pleasure or reacts to threats, even when actions result in catastrophic long-term harm. To prevent that harm, the human brain utilizes a second computational layer, the highly developed cortex. The cortex has an opposing prime directive. It calculates for long-term survival and the optimization of reproductive success. In this updated logic flow, the cortex intercepts subcortical impulses. It integrates complex social norms and environmental rules into the final behavioral output. Consider a hungry driver seeking a parking spot. The subcortex identifies a disability space, outputting an impulse to park there and satisfy hunger. The cortex overrides this. It calculates variables like financial fines and observer hostility, recognizing that parking there would be detrimental. We see the same override at a dinner party. A guest may be physically hungry, but they wait for everyone to be seated before eating. This delay is a calculated trade-off. The guest sacrifices immediate physical gratification to preserve the long-term social standing required to ensure future invitations and alliances. The cortex functions as a vital computational handbrake, preventing primitive impulses from destroying the complex social structures humans need to survive. Even with these two layers, we still see vast differences in individual behavior. This is because every brain processes these universal inputs through a unique filter of character traits. These traits act as the final neural filter, determining how a specific brain weighs inputs and produces unique behavioral outputs. We can plot these traits along two intersecting axes: introversion to extroversion on the horizontal, and stability to instability on the vertical. The introvert-extrovert axis governs the mechanism of emotional expression, determining if feelings are contained internally or projected outward. An introvert naturally restrains their behavior, even under high threat, while an extrovert will loudly broadcast their internal state through shouting or physical action. The stable-unstable axis measures response predictability. A stable brain produces consistent, expected emotional reactions to similar inputs. An unstable brain produces volatile reactions that make it impossible to predict their behavior, even in response to ordinary events. Every human brain occupies a specific coordinate on this grid, and that position dictates their baseline behavioral reality. This coordinate system creates two modes of action: planned behavior and reactive behavior. In a job interview, an applicant named Max might have a naturally unstable, extroverted coordinate. However, his cortex actively masks these traits to meet professional expectations. This is planned behavior. The cortex expends significant energy to bypass the natural personality coordinate, allowing many of us to function in uncomfortable social situations. But the cortex is slower than the subcortex. If an input happens too quickly for the cortical filter to process, it becomes a surprise input. Imagine the interviewer suddenly says, "Someone you worked with called to warn me about you." To Max, this is a psychological surprise input. This surprise triggers reactive behavior, bypassing the cortex and hitting the subcortex directly. Max reacts instantly, jumping out of his chair and shouting. This is the honest, unfiltered reflection of his true coordinate on the personality matrix. While the cortex can construct a temporary facade, sudden environmental stress strips it away to reveal the brain's true operational baseline. Within this architecture, we can now define the mechanics of a healthy brain processing system. Different survival contexts require different responses. A person must be tough during a negotiation, but tender with their family. Therefore, health is defined by flexibility, the ability to seamlessly shift your output coordinate across the matrix as the environment changes. Clinical personality disorders are defined by the opposite, pathological rigidity. The individual is locked at a specific coordinate, regardless of the situation. This rigidity is paired with distorted threat perception, where ordinary inputs trigger massive subcortical alarms. A schizoid brain misprocesses basic social contact as an existential threat. This makes social interaction physically and mentally overwhelming. A narcissistic brain misprocesses a lack of appreciation as a severe threat to survival, leading to emotional collapse or rage when they aren't the center of attention. An obsessive-compulsive brain misprocesses compromise as an absolute void. It locks into rigid perfectionism because any flaw is perceived as a threat to the system. These structural rigidities do not have simple biological cures. However, because the brain is flexible, understanding this code allows individuals to develop the motivation and techniques required for emotional regulation. We can also use this model to fine-tune our daily social interactions. By deliberately modulating our voice volume, pacing, and facial expressions, we can provide specific sensory data that bypasses the threat alarms in other people's brains, encouraging social cohesion over conflict.